Hi, this is Dr. Shweta. This video is about the historical background and the popular literature during the Romantic era. Let us understand the historical background of the Romantic age, which began from the year 1798 and continued up to the year 1837, roughly when we believe that the age called the Romantic age ended after the Queen Victoria ascended the throne of England in the year 1837. Though the Romantic age is assumed to have begun in the year 1798, but the reaction to the literary norms of the previous age started much earlier. A strong reaction against the kind of poetry that Alexander Pope used to write started in motion, and instead of giving emphasis on intellect and reason, the focus was on the principle of spontaneity. So in a way there, a Romantic age started a more liberal and natural way of writing poetry. The English poetry of this period was being written in association with various stages of French Revolution that happened in the year 1789 and which swept the intellectual, social and political temperament of the entire Europe. The ideals like liberty, fraternity and equality started gaining momentum. But soon after the 1980s were over, the French Revolution and its popularity declined, and the impression that the French Revolution had made on the minds of the people and the faith and hope which people received from the French Revolution, it all collapsed. But still, we find the major essence of the motto of French Revolution, that is liberty, equality and fraternity, in the poetry by great poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In order to understand the Romantic age, we must know about the major Romantic poets of this era. There were 6 Romantic poets, and the first 3 are known as the older Romantics, who are Wordsworth, Coleridge and William Blake. During the Romantic period, the dominant literary genre was poetry. The beginning of the Romantic poetry is credited to Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads, which was the collection of poems by both these poets and very important text of this period. It was first published in the year 1798 and the second edition came in the year 1800. This text or this collection of poetry influenced the Romantic movement in English literature. There are 23 poems in the first edition and 45 poems in the second edition, which is a mix of ballads, lyrics, or narrative poetry written by both these poets. All the poems are written in natural language with local or folk themes and emotional expressions. There are a few notable poems that are a part of this collection. For example, the poems like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is a long narrative poem, and then a lyrical poem like Tintern Abbey, which focuses on emotions and nature, then a poem in blank verse, The Prelude, and then a poem like The Nightingale, etc. Lyrical ballads challenged the previous age. This new age poetry gave importance to nature, emotions and individual experiences. Many poets later on in the Romantic era like Lord Byron, Shelley and John Keats were inspired from the lyrical ballads. It is important for us to know that Coleridge contributed 4 poems in this collection, among which is The Rime of Ancient Mariner, The Nightingale, The Frost at Midnight and The Tables Turned. Whereas Wordsworth contributed total of 19 poems in this collection. Some of the famous poems by Wordsworth in this collection are Tintern Abbey, The Solitary Reaper. The Prelude is written in 2 parts. Then there is To a Skylark, The World is Too Much with Us, Ode to Duty, Michael, The Idiot Boy, etc. are some of the poems contributed in this collection by Wordsworth. So that is all which you must know about this collection called Lyrical Ballads. You must remember which poems were written by Wordsworth and which ones were contributed by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Moving forward, the next important poet of the Romantic age is William Blake, whose poetry is considered as part of the Romantic movement. Though he started writing during the transitional period, but he is also a part of Romantic era, or we can say a part of the movement called the Romantic Revival. In fact, Blake is considered to be the early proponent of both Romanticism and nationalism. That means he was the one who is considered to have begun the Romanticism and the feeling of nationalism for the first time through his poetry. Blake was heavily influenced by the ideals and ambitions of the French and American revolutions. And his ideals can be seen in his works like the Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, a collection of poetry published in 1794, which has different kinds of poems or songs in it. This collection contains 54 poems divided into two sections: Songs of Innocence having 28 poems and Songs of Experience having 26 poems. Some important poems from the collections called Songs of Innocence are The Shepherd, The Lamb, The Little Boy Lost, The Little Boy Found, The Chimney Sweeper, The Little Girl Lost, The Little Girl Found, The Schoolboy, The Ecstasy, To Autumn, The Winter, To Spring, To Summer, To the Evening Star, and A Cradle Song. Whereas some important poems from Songs of Experience are The Clod and the Pebble, The Sick Rose, The Tiger, The Divine Image, Poison Tree. The Tiger is one of his famous poems with the lines, Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. The poems like The Chimney Sweeper is also one of the famous poems of William Blake, in which he raises a social issue prevalent during his time when children between the age groups of 10 years to 13 years were supposed to work as chimney sweepers, where sometimes these little children used to get stuck and die inside those soot-filled chimneys. So that's why we can say that William Blake was a nationalist poet who wrote poems related to nationalism and his country. One of the other important poems by Blake is London, which is again a poem from the Songs of Experience. This poem is also a social and political critique of the socio-economic conditions in the 18th century London. Blake comments on the poverty and inequality, corruption and exploitation, and moral and spiritual decay of the society during that time. He also comments on the oppressive system called monarchy, church, and law order during that time. Some of the important lines from this poem, London, are, I wandered through each chartered street. In every cry of every man, the mind-forged mankles, I hear the helpless soldiers sigh. Mind-forged mankles sometimes is asked in the questions that from which poem of Blake has this quote been taken. So you must remember, these lines are a true picture of the socio-political conditions of London in the 18th century. Other important poems by William Blake are The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which explores contradictions and paradoxes. The title itself is paradoxical, that is The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Then there is a poem called The Book of Thale, published in 1789 to 93, which is an allegorical poem on the nature of existence. Then comes the poem like The Book of Urizen, which is a mythological poem on creation and fall. So these were a few poems worth noting which were written by William Blake. Moving forward, let's talk about William Wordsworth as a poet in detail. The first thing that we know about Wordsworth is that he wrote a poetry collection jointly with S.T. Coleridge called the Lyrical Ballad, which I discussed in detail already. One of the poems from this collection is generally considered semi-autobiographical, which is the Prelude. Wordsworth was a poet laureate from 1843 until his death in 1850. He was one of the lake poets, which means three poets, namely Coleridge, Wordsworth and Robert Southey, were together known as the lake poets because they lived in a lake district of England at that time. A few other important poems by William Wordsworth are The Solitary Reaper, Ode to Intimations of Immortality, and the most important of them is The Prelude, which was published after his death by his wife. Now let us discuss S.T. Coleridge or Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge was an English poet, a literary critic, a philosopher too. He wrote many important poems like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, Christabel, and also his major prose works like Biographia Literaria, published in 1817, which is considered as an autobiographical and critical work by him that tells us about his life, his literary theories, and his friendships. There is a slight difference between the poetry of Wordsworth and that of Coleridge. Where Wordsworth wrote poetry representing the triumph of naturalism, Coleridge's poetry reflects the elements of supernaturalism in it. For example, in his poem Kubla Khan, we see the elements of supernatural and also the presence of Orientalism, which means the description of the East in an exotic way with an exotic imagery by using mysticism and spirituality. Many a times we see the presence of colonialism and imperialism in his poems. Let us discuss briefly about two important poems, that is Kubla Khan and The Rime of Ancient Mariner by S.T. Coleridge, one by one. First is Kubla Khan. The poem describes a fantastical or an imaginary landscape which is inspired from Marco Polo's travels to Xanadu, which was the summer place of Kubla Khan. Kubla Khan was a Mongolian king. The poem talks about a luxurious palace which was built by Kubla Khan in Xanadu, an ancient city. The poem shows Coleridge's fascination for Eastern cultures and Eastern mythology. The next is The Rime of Ancient Mariner. This poem tells the story of an ancient marine who kills an albatross, a bird which symbolizes good luck. And after killing that bird, he suffers the consequences, that is the bad luck. This poem also contains some supernatural descriptions and shows the poet's power of imagination and his use of natural imagery. The next important poet of the Romantic period is Robert Southey, who was not only a poet but also a biographer. Together with Coleridge, he wrote a play in 3 acts, which was named The Fall of Robespierre in 1794. Besides this, he wrote various poetry collections and many ballads also. He wrote many narrative poems, some of which are Madoc, Thalaba the Destroyer, Roderick, and The Curse of Kehama. So you just need to remember the names of these poems written by Robert Southey. The next important poet, which belongs to the second generation of the Romantics, or we can say the later Romantics, is John Keats. Now there were 3 poets in the second generation of Romantics: John Keats, Byron and Shelley. First, let's discuss Keats. Keats was famous for using natural imagery in his poetry. He is famous for using sensual language into his poems. He is famous for the use of the term negative capability, which means always being in uncertainties, mysteries and doubts, and not making any effort of reaching after the fact and reason. Some of his most important poems are Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode to Psyche, and On First Looking into Chapman's Homer. Endymion is a narrative poem which is again very famous. The opening lines of this poem are, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," which shows that Keats believed in the principle of beauty in all things. The other famous poems by him are Hyperion, which remained unfinished because he died. Then La Belle Dame Sans Mercy, which is a poem that means the beautiful woman without mercy, and poems like The Eve of St. Agnes. The most productive year of Keats as a poet was the year 1819, when he published his major poems. Keats died at an early age of 25 years in Rome because of tuberculosis. Let us know some of the famous lines from Keats' poems, which are important for you from the exam point of view. Thou was not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry generations tread you down. It is a line from his poem Ode to Nightingale. Then comes Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. It is a line from his poem Ode on a Grecian Urn. Another line from the same poem are Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Then we have lines like, Oh, what can all the night at arms, alone and palely loitering? These are the lines from La Belle Dame Sans Merci. The next important poet from among the second generation of romantics is P.B. Shelley. Shelley was popular for writing not only poetry but also prose fiction and many essays on political, social, and philosophical issues of his age. Much of his poetry and prose was not published during his lifetime because it might have put him under the risk of prosecution because his prose writing was politically and religiously extremist. Some of his best known poems are Queen Mab, Ozymandias, Ode to the West Wind, To a Skylark, and as I said that he also wrote prose writings, which is The Necessity of Atheism, written in 1811, for which he was expelled from University of Oxford. Shelley married Mary, the daughter of William Godwin, and Mary Shelley later became popular for writing the novel Frankenstein. He died by drowning in the year 1822. A few other important poems by Shelley are Adonis, which is an elegy on the death of John Keats. He also wrote the Cenci, which is a romantic drama. A Revolt of Islam is also one of the poems written by Shelley in 1817, which is a long narrative poem in Spenserian stanzas where the young poet hopes for a new future of the world. In his poem Queen Mab, Shelley condones all the institutions, kings and governments, church, property and marriage, and even Christianity. So he criticizes all of them. This poem was based on William Godwin's political tract, namely Political Justice. He is also known to have written a famous lyrical drama, Prometheus Unbound, which is adaptation of the famous old Greek myth. The third most important poet from the second generation of the romantic poets is Byron, or George Gordon Lord Byron. Byron was an English poet and one of the leading figures of the romantic movement. His poems popularized the image of the Byronic hero, which fascinated the public at that time. He is a kind of hero with great talent, great passion, but having a distaste for society, for social institutions like marriage, class hierarchy, and the lack of respect for any kind of rank. But he is a kind of man who faces failure in love with an arrogant behavior, and he is usually shown as an overconfident fellow with a lack of foresightedness, and this leads to his self-destruction. Byron published his first volume of poetry called Arts of Idealness and was criticized by the magazine Edinburgh Review. But Byron did not sit quietly after this criticism of his poetry and wrote a satire in response, English Bards and Scottish Reviewers, where he defended his poem. He wrote a very famous poem later on, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which was the result of his extensive journey throughout the European continent in the years 1809 to 1811. The poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage was published between 1812 to 1818 in 4 cantos. The poem follows the journey of Childe Harold, a young nobleman, as he travels through Europe and learns about life, love, and liberty. The famous quotes of Byron is, I woke up one morning and found myself famous. Some of his works are Manfred, Cain, and an unfinished poem, Don Juan. So that were the romantic poets for you. I have discussed all the 6 romantic poets with you. I hope you have understood it well. The next topic which will be under this category is about the novel writing of the romantic age, which I have covered in my next video of the same section. So let's move to the next video.